There are only 30 minutes allotted. If you'd like to have time for questioning, then use your time accordingly.
And that your...
But I would ask you to state your name and introduction for the record, please.
Thank you very much. My name is Alex Dingwall, and I'm a former educator, 37 years in the system. What's relevant to this discussion, I was over 20 years involved with government in policy, legislation, full gamut. Somehow I got volunteered in these positions. So I had a long career with regards to in the department, Director of Student Services for a number of years. I worked around the province, St. John, Miramichi, Dalhousie, Fredericton, and I was superintendent of schools for over 15 years, which in itself is a test. What I bring to this discussion, I'm focusing on education. I know a lot of discussion you've heard today, I've been trying to follow as much of it as I can, has been with regards to health. But I think, and I've heard you ask some very pertinent questions with regards to impact, how legislation will impact with regards to the school system. This is an amendment to the Schools Act, the Education Act, I should say. So it's extremely important to understand it in that context. I would like to go through my presentation, first of all, just very briefly try to delve into the context of legislation development as I saw it, how the coordination of health services in the school system, how that rolls out. It's a phenomenon that every time there is a health issue in a school, that we have to educate the public of what we're doing, how we react to it. And when media gets a hold of it, of course, it becomes more pronounced, but that's okay, because we believe we're taking extreme actions to support children's health within schools. It's critical. School system recognizes that, so we're very much in the public domain with that regards. And finally, I want to give a very concrete description of how I administered the existing bill right now, school immunization. And some people may criticize it, but I'll try to justify the decisions I made with regards to how I came about to making decisions that I did. Finally, I will assume the role as an advisor to government, to legislation, to which I've done in the past, to the premiers, to ministers and whatever. And I would say I advise in this respect to you, to when you go forward in your deliberations, to take the context of education in full regard, because that's where it happens. Now, it may be a decision to work it outside the system, and that's one of the alternatives you might want to look at. I also want to say this is my opinion. I don't represent anybody here. I'm basing my opinion on, as I said, 20 years of really in-depth experience with regards to development and the carrying out of legislation. So I think I have some background in that regard. And finally, I guess as an educator, I've made many presentations, but I've always invited questions to as I go along. So I know that's, Madam Chair, that may not be the way you've done things in the past, but I try to keep people engaged, and I tend to maybe fall into bureaucraties, into lingo, and I have no apprehension of someone stopping me saying, what exactly do you mean by that, or elaborating further. But that's up to the committee, that's up to you, Madam Chair.
The challenge that arises is then equal time.
Yeah, I realize it's a time management issue, but I really want to make sure that if I go something, I will go very quickly, and I may go over things that maybe 15 minutes from now may have been forgotten. So I just want to make sure.
They're very good at writing things down. They're pretty good at this.
Okay, my first observation, and again, some of it is my opinion only. My first observation is that when we developed legislation, I was involved in, by the way, the last review of the Ed Act, that usually public consultation precedes the development of that. This is not unique, but it's not the particular way you want to develop legislation. You want to go to the public, get a sense of what the public issue is, If I was voicing this concern, I think the concern which has been put forward by government is how can we ensure that the health of children is being properly accommodated in the province and in our schools. That discussion goes out to the public. We get feedback from the public. Then from there, legislation comes forward with regards to input. So it's a bit different, but it's not unique because in this particular instance, I sense an urgency in this legislation because of emerging facts. I'm really flummoxed by some of the statistics that have been presented over the last few days because they certainly weren't the stats and data that I dealt with when I was administering policy. And I will get to that later on. But certainly, it's the prerogative of government, by the way, to provide leadership. There's many legislative acts that have come down that have received great discussion and debate, but it's up to government to bring that forward, and that responsibility is theirs alone. And it's up to administrators within the system to follow that legislation and try to make it work. And so there's that dichotomy, there's that dynamic tension in the system. I will say that in identifying legislation over the last 30 years or 40 years that I was involved, a dramatic change happened in the late 80s and the 90s when we started to review the Ed Act, is that we put the child at the focus of the center. Before, the institutional demands were central, more central, and accommodation became a real prerogative when we were developing laws and legislation and policies. So anytime I was in committee work developing policies, the yes but question always came up. And there was a concerted effort to accommodate. And the best example I can give to you right now, and I know that you've gone through the legislation, I've heard you mention it, okay, it was the number one question, that dynamic that the Minister 8.1, I think, in the legislation says, has an obligation to provide free educational services to all children in the province. And the other dynamic, of course, I think is 15.1, the obligation of the parent to register their child in the public education system. So there's qualifications to that, which is interesting if you look at it. For instance, the first qualification is residency. Well, that's no-brainer. You should be a resident of the province of New Brunswick to participate in public education that's supported by taxpayers in this province. But there's accommodation for that. Big accommodation, as a matter of fact, that's grown in the last 10 years, that if you want to pay tuition, you can come into this province. There's also accommodation for students and exchange students. That's monitored by the department. But that's an example of accommodation to that residency requirement. Another part of the residency requirement is that you are a student in the district where your residency comes up with. Well, there's accommodation to that a student can actually go to school in another district where they're not a resident of. And there were some restrictions on that, by the way, which were taken away last legislative amendment I saw. Some superintendents were not obliging in that regard, and the minister stepped in and said, wait a second, we should be able to accommodate, make reasonable accommodations to parents who decide that they want their child in another district. And there's a whole multitude of examples why that might occur. The main one that I had to deal with a lot was custody cases, where there were two parents in different jurisdictions in the province and things like that would happen. That's not the only one, but that's an example of accommodation. And the final accommodation residency that goes into the piece is that a parent may want to choose the school they go to within a district. Now, right now, that's the responsibility of the superintendent, that the superintendent places that. There's good reasons for that. You have to manage a school district in a certain way. We strongly believe that home community schools are the best place for students to go, but some parents would say, no, I don't want to go there for whatever reason. And in the run of a year, in my district, my last district, I'd probably field about 300 requests to go to other schools. And unless it created a strain in the system, it was a reasonable accommodation to make for a parent. So that's an example of the two criteria. When a parent registers, they ask, where's your residency? And the other requirement is age, and believe it or not, there's some accommodation there. Kindergarten is our entry point, but a parent can defer to grade 1 a year. And these, at the other end, for a mature student, it's age 19, but we will have mature students apply to go to school after that requirement, and in most cases, it's a reasonable accommodation as long as it doesn't put a stress in the system. So those two, and then the third one, we have immunization. Well, the immunization in the Act was a very progressive type of legislation that came in the 90s. Very progressive. As has been pointed out, is that we're one of the few jurisdictions in North America that had this legislation that basically stated the objective, your first qualification, was to provide proof of immunization. That's a pretty strong statement to make. But, as you know now, there's accommodation for that. There's medical exemptions and there's personal exemptions. So, again, in very strict terms, those criteria for legislation, there is accommodation. And if you look through our system, in most policies, there's accommodation throughout our legislation. So it's jarring, in a sense, as a former educator, to, what can I say, challenge this way that we act in this province. Accommodation has been a lifesaver for education in this province. It's created great challenges in the system. The challenge when we first brought in Bill 85, which became not so evident very quickly, not so much for the educational needs of students, but of the medical needs of students. We had students, we had no comprehension, who were in hospitals or nursing homes around this province who never saw the light of day because they were medically compromised. And through an act, government said that's not right, they should be in the school system. And I can tell you, we went through an awful lot of angst in that. Schools, we're not ready for that. We're not able to do that. We're not trained to do that. And over the last 30, 40 years, that discussion's gone by the wayside. So we've gone from a system, a very dramatic change in the system, where we had a 40% dropout rate in this province. You have to think about that. 40% of the students who started grade 1 would not finish their grade 12. And government, in a very proactive, controversial leadership, took a leadership position. That's not acceptable. And over the 40 years, in lieu of the type of legislation we put forward for accommodation, for attempting to meet the needs of the student, I'm not talking about the parent in this point, but the student, because that's what we do in classrooms, to the best of our ability, our dropout rate is essentially the lowest in the OECD countries in the world. Among the lowest, I should say. We put the rest of Canada to shame. And a lot of provinces who have much more resources, or maybe people say better education systems, we have basically 95 to 97% of our students walking out the door with grade 12 education. That's the signal of how our legislation, our progressive legislation, and our ability to accommodate has moved this whole system forward. So, when government, and I don't, you know, in a way, you're going to say, where am I going with this? Do I support the legislation or not? It's jarring to me. It's jarring to me in a sense that accommodation for a certain population of students, I'm going to put parents over there for right, because you've heard enough about the rights of parents, but I'm going to focus in on taking away the ability of a child in our province to access the public education system because of a decision made by the family, essentially. Whether it's right or wrong, we follow public health mandate. We closely work with public health through all our policies. We work in partnership. We can't work without public health. They can't work without us. That's how close that relationship is. So I missed most of Ms. Ross's presentation yesterday, unfortunately. But I noted that when the initial issue came forward provincially, that the discussion from school systems and public health was very muted. I hope you noted that, because our focus is somewhat different. Big world out there, there's a lot of issues. But inside the public school system, our focus is on serving children first. So, over the past 30 years, it's hard to believe that the policies we have in place now to support health services is incredible. I think it's policy 704. If you haven't looked at that, Most parents who walk in the door when they register their students are extremely nervous if they believe their child is medically compromised or fragile. And I can tell you, as an administrator in the system, it was yearly, daily, weekly that I had to pick up the phone and answer to a parent who didn't feel that we were doing enough to ensure that their health and safety of their child was being taken care of properly. Policy 7, thank God that policy, it's a 14-page policy. It covers virtually everything. It outlines the responsibilities of the school, the responsibilities of the parent, very concretely. And so the message to schools is you do have a responsibility, and here's how you do it, and we'll provide the resources for that. So in this whole big picture, we have a position now, or I feel, my opinion anyway, that's remarkably different than it was even 10 years ago. I mean, diabetes took us all by the... we didn't understand that 10, 15 years ago. And when parents came to us, what are you going to do to support my child with a diabetic condition? We now have a policy and a framework to do that. You want proof of that? Go to any elementary school in the province, and you walk in the office, and probably the first thing you're going to notice is the emergency response protocols for each student in that school on the wall. So principals, teachers, every day are cognizant of the health needs of every child in that school. Where am I going with this? Immunization as a public health issue, my own personal opinion is that I fully support it. It seems that it's done tremendous advantages with regards to society and the community. The process for registration, and here's where I get into how I came to decisions, is very comprehensive. And this is fairly new, but, you know, in the next couple of months, there's going to be a notice in the paper talking about registration for next year. In that registration process, the parent will walk in, they'll meet someone with regards to education, and by the way, public health will be right there also to talk about health issues. Usually public health nurses. That's always organized by school, by maybe regions or whatever, however is most efficient. It's flagged very early in the fall about when a parent has concerns about the immunization policy. So there is a time here. So it's flagged early. We continue on with that process going on to the next spring because we have to finalize resources and staffing for school, mainly. But that flag about whether they've met the qualification with regards to immunization continues. So come May, usually, there's a profile developed. We basically are assigning the students to school, and the principal receives that. They talk about class orientation, and oh, by the way, has everyone met immunization requirements? Well, in a lot of cases they have. In a lot of cases, elementary schools, you'll see 100%. This is where I don't understand the stats that are being presented provincially right now. I'll tell you what happened in the district. So in May, end of May, the principal usually flags us and says, what do I do now? I said, you better send out that first letter saying that if you don't get immunized, you're putting the enrollment of your child at risk. This is not the ones that are medically exempt, by the way. Or exempt for personal reasons. Right now, they're allowed to be exempt. So those kids are in the category public health know about them. The conundrum in that policy was the ones that refused to tell us in the registration process whether their child is immunized or not. That is a quandary which, frankly, I don't understand. I understand it better now. But anyway, so we'd send that letter out. We sent it out again in September when we verified enrollments. And this is what I don't understand, in October, because it was one of the meetings that I was called to in partnership with Regional Health, and we'd sit down and analyze that data that we had. We'd analyze the exemption rates permitted, and we'd also analyze the information that we didn't have. I want to tell you that those numbers are were very, very small in my experience. Very rarely did we go below 95% in a school. It did happen on occasion. And sometimes, what was interesting, there was no trends, there was no actual understanding of why people did this, because we didn't compile that data, except for 2 years we did. Health and ourselves went in partnership and sent people out to talk to parents personally on the issue, whatever. And the data that came back, and I certainly understand government's statement with regards to the amount of education and arm twisting and whatever, really doesn't have an impact. We didn't get very much uptake with regards to parents who were changing their minds or agreeing to sign a form saying, for personal reasons, I don't want my child to be vaccinated. Quandary. But it's not a quandary of health, in a sense, it's a quandary of documentation. And that's where I sort of got antsy. Because I said, why am I going to exclude a kid from school because of a bureaucratic ineptitude of a system that couldn't properly track students from the start? All that data is somewhere in the system. And health, my regional health partners, I knew it was an ask at least 10 years ago with regards to have a central registration. I know across the country, when they talked about it, that governments were very reluctant to go for a central registry, which was the main issue with regards to students or parents who would not signify for whatever reason. So I'm sitting there, and probably one of the toughest days I had as administrator when the secretary walked in with 20 to 30 letters saying, this is the final warning, you better shape up, tell us what the status is, or else your child is going to be won't be permitted to come back to school. So I did that letter, and when I talked to the principals about it, it used to be 1 or 2 students. I mean, if it was 1 or 2% of your child population in a school of 200, it may be 1 student. It may be 2 students. We didn't find big gaps of like 20, 30 students. Now, when the students come up to larger schools, obviously, when you get to Fredericton High School and you have 5% population, you're talking about probably a significant number of students, as was in KV. When they identified the students, you're talking about a fair number of students that compromised the whole situation. So it's a real situation for health, and I understand it, but I can tell you that was the final letter that we sent. The next letter would have been the student coming home with the Christmas report card, and the next letter, very good performance, Johnny. By the way, see you later. To put it bluntly. And as an educator, I was not willing to compromise the continual, very critical, important integration of that student in the public school system with all the angst that goes with that. Schools had worked 3 months or actually a full year with families and children to get them ready for kindergarten, and here we were saying because of bureaucracy, not because of educational or health reasons. And so you're going to come to the second question I asked with regional health people, which was critically important to me. When we're making that decision, are we compromising the health of other students in the school system? So here is the example that I'm going to use that is, and I don't know if it was timely about the situation in St. John, but it demonstrated how public health and education react to medical health emergencies. And this was big news. Now, I was glad it was big news, to tell you the truth, because in the run of a school year, that would happen throughout the province several times, but it wouldn't have received the same attention. We'd have cases of meningitis in the school. As a matter of fact, we went through HIV policy, where we excluded students for a period of time. That policy was rectified. We went through SARS. SARS is very interesting. In my district, I had 2 families who were quarantined. And the reason for the quarantine is because they traveled to an area. It's not that they had SARS, but they traveled to an area for SARS, so the risk was there. So health and the school intervened. We had H1N1. Probably the biggest immunization project that the province ever endeavored, and unfortunately, or fortunately, depending which way you want to take it, the uptake it looked big, but it was very low. Every year in the school system, we react or take action with regards to flu. Now, there was a time in the system where we would close almost 50% of our elementary schools because we had 40% of our students who were, and staff, by the way, who were impacted by flu. Public health with immunization, schools with proper hygiene programs for parents and students, and the promotion of those programs. It's rare today now. You will hear a flu epidemic coming, but it is unique to hear of a school actually closing. So the impact was, am I getting close to my end? Okay.
I'd like to field questions from the committee then.
Okay. So I am going to end with regards to what I can't leave you hanging. I wouldn't be a good person if I didn't point in a direction or think. The first thing I would say is that I think there are alternatives to the legislation that need to be looked at. I think it's done it's very fast. I feel for the committee and try to digest all this information. I perfectly support government in the initiative with regards to trying to increase what it seems to be a decrease in the importance of immunization. I really believe that the information system is going to make a dramatic difference with regards to having more concrete data. I would recommend, if at all possible, I know there's urgency, but that there could be breathing time to get that data and verify it. At least public health and education could react if there is an issue. And I'm not going to say there is or there isn't. I don't, as Mr. Russell said, not really quite sure. We need better data, what's happening in our schools, our province. Another thing I would recommend, and again, some people have mentioned this, increased focus on the positive aspects. And again, there are many alternatives in how to do that. Singularly, we've done it basically one way, public health, do it very well. So I'd recommend increased focus in on that. And the final thing is, and I heard some people mention it, and I don't know how you do this, but it seemed to me that if at all possible, you get a concrete judicial decision before you move forward. Because the policies or legislation is extremely hard to change once it's in there. It would seem to me, in some ways, that you're going to get legal opinion. Every time I faced the court, every time I faced human rights, I got a legal opinion. But I was always advised it could go either way, no matter what. They would back me up, the minister would back me up in my positions, and I can tell you that in my experience, a lot of the cases that I was challenged on in court, human rights and whatever, did not go in my favor. I was, I'm biased. I was trying to follow legislation, follow certain standards, but they did not go in my direction. I would really believe that to find a concrete judicial decision, I agree that until there's a judicial decision, no one knows exactly how it's going to be decided. So we're taking great risk in this province, and that's fair to do, because to be a leader, sometimes you got to take risks. I don't like the statement that the rest of the provinces are looking at us to do, looking at what's going to happen here. A lot of times you lead, and 2 years later you look behind you and no one's following. And you have to wonder, well, why do we put ourselves out there in that way? I think government takes a big risk in this legislation unless you somehow get a concrete judicial decision, not a legal opinion. Because I can get, well, you're involved enough in this that to understand that legal opinions, both sides can be argued. But it's up to the judge to finally make a decision. And by the way, most judges really voice an opinion. They don't want to be involved in these kinds of decisions because they can't believe that the public school system or any government institution can't come to grips with meeting the needs of their population. So that's basically, in essence, what I have to say. I tried to focus in on education. I'd understand you'd have a number of concerns and questions about that. I've tried to describe what happens in schools. And again, I don't want to, any way, shape, or form, take away the government's initiative in trying to enhance immunization programs in this province. Thank you.
Thank you very much. One question, because we are right at the end of the time. Go ahead, Mr. Shays.
My goodness, there's so many questions to ask. From what you said, I believe that you're pro-accommodation. You believe we should be giving people some sort of accommodation. And you talked about how strict you were in your district when you were head of the district in making sure that you had all of those records, and it was there was a process that was followed, and by Christmas time, it was done.
By September, end of October.
So if I was to tell you that I received information from the district where we had this outbreak, and they had 6,000 incomplete records, what would you say to that? What would you answer to that? 6,000 out of 27,000?
Didn't happen in my district.
No, well, this is what I'm saying.
I'm like you. I don't understand that, and I believe that's why Ms. Russell, again, I'm speculating, would not jump into that discussion. Because what we do in the districts, and by the way, some people challenge that this information should be public information. We are very cognizant of confidentiality, and that if you have a student in a small school whose parent decides that they don't want to follow the it's very hard to keep information like that confidential. So I don't understand that. I can't answer that, but I can tell you in 15 years that I managed it, I knew by the end of October every individual student. I conversed with the principal. They were small numbers. I had 30 things to sign out of 900 students, letters to sign. And by the way, in our discussion with Regional Health, they also shared information with me from other districts. By the way, one of the things that drive a lot of people crazy is the inconsistencies among application of policies in schools and districts around the province. Drives the minister crazy, I know, because he will find good practice in one jurisdiction and then go to another jurisdiction and see no evidence of that. So I really feel for that. I can't say that this problem wasn't happening in another district. All I can tell you, it wasn't happening in mine. Was I more vigilant? I don't know. I just thought that was standard practice. We didn't talk about health policies very much among superintendents, especially that one. We talked about the implementation of health policies. That was common. But generally the discussion was with regional public health people. And they have the same issue that we have. They report to the provincial health people. So there's that mix. Getting concrete data should be a real concern for your overview to make sure that the data is accurate. I cannot explain that. I was flummoxed by those stats. All I could tell them is it didn't happen with me.
Well, I thank you for your time. I know that we could go on, and this discussion could go on for a long time. I thank you for your time. I thank you for the information you shared with us on your views. And Madam Chair, unfortunately, that's it.
Thank you very much.